Good morning. I'm delighted to welcome you today to the launch of the 2020 Future Energy Scenarios. My name is Catherine Isles and I'm responsible for the Stakeholder Engagement Programme for FES. I'll be taking you through this morning's session. Firstly, I hope that you, your families, friends and colleagues have remained safe and well over recent weeks and adapted to the environment we're now living in. During this morning's session, we'll be hearing from Fintan Sly, Director of the ESO, who will share with you a year of change, the role of the ESO, and how our teams have worked with industry over the past year to produce the scenarios, and some of the changes we have made following stakeholder engagement. Fintan will then take you through the important key messages for FES 2020. Following Fintan, Mark Herring, Senior Strategy Manager, will be sharing with you the important findings from this year's analysis. Mark will then touch on next steps and plans for our autumn engagement. Following a short break, we'll recommence for questions. If you have a question at any point during the session, then please use the Ask a Question function on your screen. We'll endeavour to answer as many questions as we can during the time. During late August, we'll be publishing the FES 2020 Q&A document that will summarise and respond to questions received throughout the week of FES launch. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping points to cover. If you experience any audio or visual issues this morning, then please click on the question mark symbol on the yellow bar on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can contact the support team who will hopefully be able to resolve your issue. On your screen, you can either make the presenter or the slides larger by clicking the small icon in the corner of the video, or just clicking on the slides on the right-hand side. This may help when we reach some of the more detailed charts and graphs in the presentation. We're keen to hear your views on the launch event this year, and if this is a format you would like us to consider for next year. There's a short survey on your screen, which would be grateful if you could complete during the morning. You'll also see the agenda for the week on one of your tabs. As you may know, we are hosting a series of presentations on Wednesday and Thursday this week, and it'd be great if you're able to join us. These sessions will provide the next level of detail to the analysis, and you can find the information and links to register on the ESO website. The link to the website, together with links to social media and the suite of FES documents that we've just published, is on the Documents and Link tab on your screen. We're sharing the launch this week on Twitter using the hashtag FES2020, which you will see on the right-hand corner of your slides. So please do join the online conversation, and during August we will continue to share the key insights and videos using the hashtag. I'd now like to introduce Fintan Sly to you to talk through the key messages for FES 2020. Thank you, Fintan.
Thanks very much, Catherine, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us as we launch the Future Energy Scenarios for 2020. As we all attend this first ever virtual launch of the Future Energy Scenarios, I think we can't help but acknowledge the huge change and uncertainty that we live with today. I think, therefore, it's worth taking a step back and recognising the full scale of change that has occurred in our energy landscape, and indeed in society, over the past 12 months since we published our 2019 scenarios. 2020 has indeed been a year of change. We've seen the energy transition continue at pace, with the electricity system tripling its previous record for coal-free generation, with 67 days of no coal-fired generation earlier this year. But it's not just windy, sunny spring months when we have cleaner energy. The carbon intensity of the winter just past was 14% lower than the previous year. Progress across the whole energy system also continues, with government's CCUS action plan aiming for commissioning of the UK's first CCUS facility by the mid-2020s, and 6 industrial clusters receiving funding for innovative approaches to transitioning some of our hardest to decarbonise industries. Hydrogen development has seen a huge step change, with targeted innovation projects proliferating and industry actors formalising their collaboration, which will be critical for developing this key tool in reaching net zero. It was also just over a year ago that BEIS and Ofgem published the first report from the Energy Data Task Force chaired by Laura Sands. And we've since seen the industry embrace its recommendations through a flurry of digitisation strategies, tangible projects to modernise energy data, and, most crucially, coordination of governance, standards and transparency, which will help unlock the value of data in our energy system. Policy has a huge influence on the energy industry, and it's worth reminding ourselves of some of the key changes in the past 12 months. These are bigger than the energy sector, but will undoubtedly influence it. Earlier this year, we saw Brexit occur, and we're now in the transition period of the UK's withdrawal from the EU. The general election in December delivered a new Prime Minister and a new majority government looking to build momentum and set policy to deliver on net zero. And looking further afield, we've also seen new energy decarbonisation policies and strategies published by many of our neighbouring countries, to whom our energy systems are physically connected and with whom we cooperate in order to deliver secure, clean, affordable energy to consumers. And lastly, as we started to move into spring earlier this year, the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the globe, causing disruption to every aspect of our lives, and for many, a tragic threat to the health and lives of us and our loved ones. As the country responded to COVID-19 through the early months of 2020, we saw an unprecedented change in the behaviour of energy consumers and challenges for the systems that supplied them. As organisations and key workers rapidly prioritised the activity crucial to the functioning of our society, we saw the delay and deprioritisation of many non-critical projects. But we also saw how people and organisations can pull together in a crisis, and how quickly progress can be made when needed. But as we continue to relax lockdown and look ahead to the impacts of COVID-19 and what it may continue to impact across society, including the energy industry for years to come, we're already seeing policy decisions for economic stimulus that accelerate energy efficiency initiatives, alongside continued questions about the long-term viability of carbon-intensive energy sources. There are also less tangible and indeed far less predictable issues, such as how the behaviour of energy consumers might have fundamentally changed because of COVID-19. A very real example of that is where we are all right now in terms of remote working and what impact this is having on energy demand in the home, at the workplace, and indeed for transport between locations. 2020 has indeed been a year of fundamental change to our energy system and to our society more broadly. And this has changed how all of us think and operate on a daily basis. Here at the Electricity System Operator, we're no different. And the past year has seen huge amounts of change. Both change that we have driven in order to deliver greater value for users of the energy system, as well as external change in our operating environment, as I just talked about. As part of our RIIO-2 business plan, we've embraced 4 2025 ambitions, which place us on track to playing our role towards a net zero energy system. Firstly, an electricity system that can operate carbon-free. When sufficient zero carbon generation is available, we will have transformed the system such that all of it can be utilised, enabling the energy transformation, but also bringing down balancing costs. A whole system strategy that supports net zero by 2020, ensuring that the actions we take are joined up across sectors and ultimately deliver the best outcome for GB economy and all consumers. Promoting competition everywhere. We continue to push for competitive markets and solutions across all areas, from the provision of balancing services, to the solutions to network issues, to developing options for competitive onshore transmission. And finally, operating as a trusted partner with all of you, our stakeholders and our customers, ensuring you can rely on us to do the right thing and to deliver on our promises. Of course, all of these, BESS plays a key role, creates a foundation for the collaboration and system thinking that is needed to achieve our 2050 net zero target. The FES community of stakeholders stretches across the energy industry and beyond. Over 400 stakeholders fed into our analysis, which is used in network planning and investment across the regulated sectors of gas and electricity, both transmission and distribution. Across the industry and the private sector, those who invest in and operate the production and delivery of energy to consumers. Policy and regulation across central and local government, the CCC, Ofgem. And as the slide shows, the reach and engagement is growing beyond the energy industry and networks, with over 1/3 of those 400 plus stakeholders involved in the creation of FES this year coming from outside of traditional energy industry organizations. And these include everything from think tanks to consumer groups, to innovators, to non-energy organizations from sectors across the whole system, such as agriculture and waste. I also hope you'll have seen that we've been responding to feedback with new approaches around stakeholder engagement across FES. For example, the FES Network Forum, which has formalized a whole energy conversation for network companies who use our FES analysis to fulfill their license conditions for GB consumers. Targeted deep dive engagement to unpick key uncertainties through the new Bridging Our Gap to Net Zero program. I'm working with distribution network companies across gas and electricity to standardize the approach to future scenario analysis across networks and ultimately improve outcomes for consumers into the future. So looking at FES 2020, there are many big changes which we'll be covering later in the session and throughout indeed the sessions later on this week. But maybe just to highlight a few here. We've collaboratively developed the new scenarios and a framework to reflect the net zero ambition and impact of societal change. 3 of our scenarios reach net zero emissions by 2050. We have reframed the FES report to focus on the perspective of the future energy consumer and that of the whole system. We and indeed stakeholders as we engage with you believe that shifting perspectives is critical to decarbonising our whole energy system. And this is one small, but we believe important step in this. And finally, this year we're moving to an interactive digital first FES report and phasing out the paper copies that we've used in the past. So moving to give you an overview of the key messages in FES. So the FES key messages are what we see as the big takeaway points from the analysis each year. They're where we join the dots and draw nearly a full year of analysis up to a higher level in an attempt to provide a high-level picture of some of the key issues coming out from the detailed analysis that we've done. There are 4 key messages. I'll just run through each of them with you. First key message is that net zero is achievable. Reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2050 is achievable. However, this requires immediate action across all key technologies and policy areas and full engagement across society and end consumers. All three of our net zero scenarios have a similar trajectory of approximately 15 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent annual reductions between now and 2050. But they achieve this in very different ways. Levels of societal change differ, impacting elements such as energy efficiency, the use of hydrogen, and how consumers engage with transport on a daily basis. And it's not just about the end point of 2050. We need to see change on a continuous basis, starting immediately. This means that cross-sector regulation and services are needed to simplify the changes consumers need to make. We need to improve energy efficiency across all sectors, and this is a no-regrets action. It enables all low-carbon technologies and supports meeting peak and annual demands for energy. Significant investment in low-carbon generation will be required across all net zero pathways. And finally, heat decarbonisation requires urgent policy decisions to drive change across the whole energy system. Our second key message is around scaling up new technologies. Specifically, that hydrogen and carbon capture use and storage must be deployed for net zero. Industrial scale demonstration projects need to be operational this decade. We must move quickly on these technologies because they need to be deployed at scale and to become an integrated part of the whole energy system for net zero. In a net zero world in 2050, hydrogen will provide between 1 and 3/5 of our energy. CCUS will combine with bioenergy to deliver up to 62 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent of negative emissions. In order to achieve this, policy support is required to ensure strong enough investment signals to scale hydrogen production at the pace required and to ensure this is done at the lowest cost for consumers. The development of the CCUS value chain requires support and coordination across policy, regulation, and industry. And hydrogen electrolyzers play an additional whole system role in integrating renewable generation. When paired with hydrogen storage and power generation, they can provide seasonal flexibility, which is important for whole system planning. Our third key message is around the shifting economics of energy. The economics of energy supply and demand fundamentally shift in a net zero world. Markets must evolve to provide incentives for investment in flexibility and zero carbon generation. For the next 3 decades, there needs to be an average of 3 gigawatts of new wind generation and 1.4 gigawatts of new solar generation installed every year. The investment signals to drive this rate of increase in zero marginal cost generation will require fundamental change in our markets. Looking briefly at the chart, you can see the fundamental market change will also be required in order to operate a system with this generation mix, including the need to incentivize more system flexibility than we do today, particularly from demand-side sources. And while smart charging is just gaining traction today, by 2050 we could see over 5 million vehicles actively engaged in energy markets, providing up to 19 gigawatts of flexibility services through vehicle-to-grid services at peak times. This also means that the concept of peak electricity demand and how it's applied in planning and operating the system is changing, as the ability of demand to ramp up and down to meet supply and take advantage of low prices increases over time. And our final key message is around whole system digitalization. Open data and digitalization underpin the whole system thinking required to achieve net zero. This is key to navigating increasing complexity at the lowest cost for consumers. Building on the previous key message, data is a key enabler for the net zero energy system of the future, where every connected source of demand and supply needs to have the opportunity to actively engage in markets and change its behavior accordingly. In addition to smart charging and vehicle-to-grid, heating demand could provide a significant source of system flexibility. In 2050, nearly half of all homes could shift their electric heating demand away from peak times, either through demand-side response actions or utilizing thermal storage, or by switching hybrid heat pumps over to the use of hydrogen boilers when it's efficient to do so. Therefore, this means that as the number of energy market participants continues to rapidly grow, open data access is fundamental to ensuring energy efficiency across all of these sectors and markets. So this brings us to the end of the key messages for FES 2020. I'm going to hand you back to Catherine now, who will give you an overview of the rest of the mornings and introduce Mark, who will talk through some of the analysis. Catherine, over to you.
Thank you, Fintan. What a year it's been and continues to be so. The next 5 years will certainly be an exciting and challenging time for the ESO and the energy industry. We'll now turn our attention to the FES 2020 analysis. I'd like to introduce Mark Herring, Senior Strategy Manager at the ESO, who will talk through the key findings from this year's analysis. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Catherine. Good morning, everyone. It's fantastic to be here and sharing this with you today, as the team have done an incredible job with this year's FES, and I know that many of you on the call today have also contributed at some point over the past year to this work. So thank you to all of those who've been involved in building with this year's scenarios. It really is a new world launching FES virtually. I know I'm not the only one who's missing the buzz of having everyone together in the same place and feeling that energy that comes from face-to-face interaction. However, as the saying goes, every cloud has a silver lining, and in this case, it's that this is the largest ever FES launch conference we've had, and it has over twice as many registrations as we've had in previous years. So even though we're all sat in our homes in front of a screen, you can take heart in the knowledge that there are more people than ever engaging in the discussions that are so vital to the future of our energy system. So today, I'll be talking through an overview of this year's analysis. Before we get started though, on your screen, as Catherine mentioned earlier, you are able to make the slides larger by clicking on them, which might be useful when we reach some of the more detailed charts and graphs in this presentation. In this overview, we'll cover the 4 scenarios and the scenario framework. We'll then move on to looking at energy demand for the end consumer, and we'll do that across all fuels. And then we'll wrap up by looking at where that energy is coming from on the supply side, and we'll do that on a fuel-by-fuel basis. So we'll start with the scenario framework. For FES 2020, we've worked with stakeholders to design a new framework and set of scenarios. This allowed us to best explore the uncertainty in the energy industry that we all see today. So hopefully many of you will have already seen this framework a few times. And for those of you who managed to join for the deep dive sessions later this week, you'll see it being used as a tool to explain many of the ranges of uncertainty in the analysis. So today, I'll just highlight some of the key drivers behind each of the scenarios to give some context to the analysis. So if you look at the horizontal axis, we've retained the speed of decarbonisation from last year's future energy scenarios. But on the vertical axis, we've used the level of societal change to differentiate between potential pathways for the future. You've already heard that reaching net zero by 2050 requires change at both scale and pace, and consumer engagement is critical in achieving this. This consumer engagement is even more important in some of the pathways we could take, such as consumer transformation and leading the way. Now, if we look at the scenarios themselves, we've got 2 scenarios, consumer transformation in yellow and system transformation in blue, which meet the government decarbonisation target of net zero emissions by 2050. And they do this in different ways. So for consumer transformation, we see higher levels of societal change. We see consumers willing to change their behaviour and become more engaged in their use of energy, leading to a scenario with higher electrification of heat, higher energy efficiency levels, and more demand-side flexibility. Then looking at system transformation, which also meets net zero in 2050, but does so with lower levels of societal change, where consumers are relatively less inclined to change their behaviour. And this is balanced out by changing the energy system, where we see greater use of hydrogen being used in domestic heating, which requires relatively less progress made in energy efficiency measures. And we see system flexibility being provided from the supply side. We then look to the top right, in green, leading the way is a scenario that decarbonises faster. We've pushed our modelling assumptions harder here to see the impact on when we believe we could credibly reach net zero while still supported by robust evidence and stakeholder input. In this scenario, we see significant lifestyle change and the fastest credible speed of decarbonisation. And then lastly, in the bottom left, in grey, steady progression shows the slowest credible speed of decarbonisation and minimal behavioural change. This is the only scenario which does not meet net zero by 2050. However, it's worth noting it does decarbonise faster than the steady progression and consumer evolution scenarios from FES 2019. And this reflects just how much the dial has shifted in the past year. Lastly, it's worth mentioning that FES 2020 analysis does not include the impact of COVID-19. While this is an important uncertainty in the future of energy, our analysis is well underway as COVID-19 hit, and the long-term impacts will continue to be understood well into the future. So we'll be engaging with stakeholders from autumn onwards to understand these impacts in more detail. So shifting on to consumer demand for energy. When we look at consumer demand for energy, it's important to consider this across the whole energy landscape and not just in the silos of different fuels like gas and electricity. This chart shows the end user whole energy demand for homes, transport, and industrial and commercial consumers across electricity, natural gas, and hydrogen. Note that it does not include demand for aviation, rail, and maritime sectors. So when looking at this chart, there are three main things to note: the removal of fossil fuels, the fall in demand to 2050, and the emergence of hydrogen as a fuel. So firstly, the removal of fossil fuels. So as you can see on the left-hand side of the chart, there's a large amount, 73% in fact, of today's energy coming from gas in blue and oil and petroleum in grey. And this is entirely gone by 2050 in our net zero scenarios. This needs to be replaced with low carbon fuels and technology, and even in steady progression, which doesn't meet the net zero target, we see the carbon intensity of fuels like natural gas being reduced through blending low carbon gases such as green gas and hydrogen into the network. Secondly, if you look at the total annual demand, today we're at about 1,400 terawatt hours. And in 2050, this is reduced across all scenarios to as low as 560 terawatt hours in consumer transformation. This change is largely down to energy efficiency progress, with the electrification of heating, transport, and some industrial commercial processes as well. So in the key messages, Fintan mentions the potential reduction in heat energy needed. And our net zero scenarios employ a combination of building for thermal efficiency through insulation and the increased efficiency of new technology like heat pumps to achieve a reduction of between 40 and 75% in heating demand for the average home in our net zero scenarios. And across transport, demand reductions are wide-ranging across all four scenarios, falling between a 2/3 and a 3/4 reduction due to significant efficiency gains as 100% of small passenger vehicles electrify and larger vehicles such as HGVs shift from diesel to either electricity, hydrogen, or in steady progression scenario, natural gas. And lastly, on hydrogen. So today, as you can see, hydrogen doesn't appear in our energy mix, but in 2050, it can deliver a large proportion of energy to end consumers in both system transformation and leading the way. I'll go into more on the later slide as to where that hydrogen might come from. So it's worth saying that while net zero is achievable, there'll have to be lots of changes along the way to make it happen, including zero natural gas boilers in net zero scenarios in 2050, including energy efficiency progress made across the board, and also looking at some of our hardest to decarbonize processes across industrial and commercial demand, where we need to shift to a range of diverse actions with electrification and hydrogen. So next, we'll move on to look to where this energy comes from, and we'll do so on a fuel-by-fuel basis, starting with electricity. So this chart's showing electricity supply, and it shows the level of installed generation capacity. And you'll notice that there's a small diamond there, and that's showing the peak demand, the peak annual demand. So on the left here, we can see today we have a total capacity of approximately 110 gigawatts. And that's meeting a peak demand of just under 60 gigawatts. A large portion of our electricity capacity is coming from fossil fuels in the grey box there. And 40 gigawatts or so of that, or a third of total generation, is coming from natural gas-fired generation. But then if we move across to look at 2030, and as 2030 comes up on the slide, you can see a step change in just a decade. Fossil fuel generation is already reducing. It's being replaced by strong growth in interconnection in orange and renewables in green, lime, and yellow. While peak demand may not have shifted hugely, with it either staying stable at 59 gigawatts in steady progression or increasing by up to 13% in consumer transformation, the shift of decarbonisation is made really clear by looking at generation capacity, which increases by between 30 and 60%. Consumer transformation and leading the way have the highest growth in storage, shown in the lilac box at the top of the stack on the chart, to support the intermittent renewables. And we can see the start of bioenergy paired with carbon capture and storage to generate both power and deliver negative emissions. And this is the thin sliver of purple on the chart. But then if we shift out to 2050, we see another big step change. We see both peak and generation capacity increasing even more significantly as the electrification of heat and transport drives more energy demand onto the electricity system. We see peak demand increasing by approximately 1 2/3 from today's level, and generation capacity increasing as much as threefold in consumer transformation. Fossil fuel is not present in any net zero scenario. However, we do see some hydrogen fuel generation in blue. We use hydrogen generation rather than a combination of natural gas generation plus carbon capture technology, as this is a relatively low capital cost and makes it more economic for running at low load factors. And new for phase 2020, if you look at leading the way, we've included some off-grid wind generation, and this will be coupled with offshore production of hydrogen. And again, I'll go into more on this in our hydrogen deep dive. We've got one more slide on electricity, and that's to cover the important topic of flexibility. So as the electricity system decarbonizes, flexibility will become increasingly important. So if we could go on to just one more slide, please, Catherine. So this slide shows different types of flexibility. And while comparing flexibility across different types is a bit like comparing apples and pears, as different forms of flexibility can offer different attributes and services. This chart at least gives an overview of the relative size of each type of flexibility available. Key things to note on this chart are, firstly, there's a significant increase in flexibility. So in steady progression, we see a doubling in flexibility capacity, but across consumer transformation and leading the way, it's a fourfold increase on today's levels. Secondly, dispatchable generation declines as interconnection increases and new technologies come to the fore, including electricity storage, vehicle to grid, and fuel switching and hybrid heat pumps. And lastly, demand side response. This becomes much more important in the net zero scenarios in 2050. The level of demand side response is linked to the level of consumer engagement. So you can see our two scenarios of consumer transformation and leading the way with high levels of societal change will have more demand side response in them. So if we shift fuels now and look to natural gas supply. So the natural gas supply on this chart shows that the different sources of natural gas. Firstly, UKCS, so the UK continental shelf in yellow, imports in grey, shale in orange, and green gas in purple. There will be considerable change between today and 2050 as the UKCS production declines. And you can see that across our net zero scenarios, green gas is limited as bioresources, which are the feedstocks for this type of fuel, are a scarce resource and are deployed in other sectors. So we know that the use of natural gas will change over this period between now and 2050, and we see a large proportion of gas being used to create hydrogen through methane reformation and coupled with CCUS. You can also see a small blue line on the chart, and this shows the amount of gas that will be required to produce that hydrogen through methane reforming. So if we go across each scenario, looking at leading the way, let's see natural gas supply effectively at zero in 2050. whereas in consumer transformation and system transformation, the majority of gas is used to produce hydrogen, so it's done at very different scales. And in its steady progression, we see similar levels of natural gas being used today. And this is driven by a heating sector which has made relatively little progress in decarbonising, as well as you can see the import dependency is reduced in this scenario through the use of shale and green gas. And last to note is that this is the only scenario where shale is present due to the reduced levels of support from government and consumers. So now we're going to move on to hydrogen supply. And it's useful to view hydrogen supply next to natural gas supply, and as it shows the linkages in that methane reformation process that I was just mentioning. So the first thing to note is that hydrogen plays a key role in all three net zero scenarios, with at least 190 terawatt hours of energy supplied through this vector. As we look across the scenarios, we can see system transformation having the highest production of hydrogen, nearly 600 terawatt hours a year being used to decarbonise the majority of heating demand across Great Britain. This hydrogen is supplied mostly through methane reformation coupled with CCUS. And you can note the link to the blue bar on the natural gas chart on the left of the slide, which shows the amount of gas being used to produce this hydrogen. In consumer transformation, there are lower levels of hydrogen, and most of this comes from electrolysis. In this scenario, hydrogen production plays a second role as it provides whole system flexibility, ramping up and down to meet variations in renewable electricity supply and integrating these generation sources into the system more efficiently. In leading the way, there are two unique elements when it comes to hydrogen. We can see an international hydrogen market developing from the early 2040s. This accelerates decarbonisation and also provides flexibility in supply, reducing the hydrogen storage requirements in the scenario. You can also see non-networked electrolysis producing hydrogen. This is offshore wind electricity generation being used to produce hydrogen, which is then transported ashore using pipes, which over a certain distance is seen as a more cost-effective method of transporting such large quantities of energy. And lastly, as we look to steady progression, there are minimal levels of hydrogen in 2050. This is because there's no carbon capture and storage present in the steady progression scenario, and therefore methane reformation is not an efficient or effective method of producing low carbon hydrogen. There is, however, a small amount of electrolysis employed, and this is to produce green hydrogen from otherwise curtailed renewable generation. This is then used either for transport or being blended into the natural gas grid to lower its carbon intensity. So this brings me to the end of the analysis overview, and it really is just scratching the surface. So please do download our report from the website. Join us on Wednesday and Thursday for our topic-specific deep dive sessions, where our analysts will be talking through these topics in more detail. And I'd like to finish up by looking ahead to next steps. So before we move on to questions and answers, it's worth noting that once the team have discussed their findings through this week and taken a much-deserved break, we'll be back and kicking off two important programs of work in the autumn. Our second iteration of the Bridging the Gap to Net Zero program, where we dig into key future uncertainties. This year, we'll be focusing on the theme of redefining peak and looking at how markets, data, and technology can help meet the challenges of the system peaks and troughs of a future decarbonised energy system. And secondly, we'll be starting the research, evidence gathering, and stakeholder engagement for FES 2021. And that starts early in autumn. So we'll be sharing the plans for this process and how you can be involved in autumn. So while FES 2020 is only just being published today, we're already aware of so much more that warrants further investigation and work in collaboration right across industry. We look forward to seeing many of you in the deep dive sessions this week, as well as through activity later in the year. So that's all from me. Thank you again for your time today. I'll hand back to Catherine now.
Thank you, Mark. We'll now take a short break for 10 minutes to review the questions that we've received. We'll be live again at 10:50 and hope you'll be able to join us for the rest of our launch for Q&A. Thanks for your time so far. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us again. As I mentioned at the beginning of the morning, if you have any questions, then please use the Ask a Tab question on your screen. If you would prefer us not to read out your name, then please let us know in the typed box when you submit your question. You're also welcome to include your organisation for us to mention if you wish. I also apologise in advance if we don't get round to reading your questions out. We'll certainly get through as many as we can. And if I could also please remind you to complete the short survey that I mentioned earlier on to decide whether a virtual option is something you would like us to consider for next year. We'll now move to Q&A. For our panel this morning, we are joined by Lauren Moody, Senior Energy Analysis Manager, together with Markham Finton, who we've already heard from. Finton, the first question is for you. How does FES fit into the ESO's 2025 goals and Rio plans? Thank you, Finton.
Thanks, Catherine. So I think all of those are consistent with each other. The FES 2050 analysis, our 2025 ambitions, and our Rio 2 business plan. In particular, FES provides the long-term overarching framework for how we see the industry and the sector developing. We then use that to inform what we need to do in the short term. And that's what you see reflected in our Rio 2 business plan that we submitted. And that's also informs our ambitions, in particular around enabling an electricity system that can operate at zero carbon. I think tying them all to the FES framework also has the advantage of making sure there's alignment, not just in what we do, but what's done right across the industry, because FES is developed in such a collaborative way across all industry stakeholders. It makes sure that the actions that we're taking then are understandable and are consistent with all of that. So there should be a golden thread running through FES, our Rio 2 business plans, and our 2025 ambitions.
Thank you, Finton. We have a question from stakeholders asking if the presentations will be made available as downloads. Yes, I can confirm that all presentations from the week, including Wednesday and Thursday deep dive sessions, will all be available on our website shortly after. And there's a link to the website in your documents and tab on documents and links tab on your portal. The next question, what does this sentence actually mean? This year's FES uses the lenses of decarbonisation and societal change to develop possible pathways for what the future of energy may be and how we could decarbonise our energy system. What do you mean by lenses? Is this referring to the axes used on the graph scenario framework graph? Mark, I think this one's for you. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Yes, so the short answer is yes. The lenses of speed of decarbonisation and level of societal change do relate to the two axes on that scenario framework. To go into a little bit more detail of answering how do we use them to develop the possible pathways. So we use those lenses or those axes to understand the fundamental drivers behind the change in the future. And an example might be seen in something like residential heating, where you might see, for level of societal change scenarios, a consumer might want to change less, and therefore they would put less insulation in their house, and they might want to have less of a change around the heating technology they use, and therefore want to stay on a boiler technology that perhaps uses hydrogen, as opposed to switching to an electrical technology such as heat pumps. And so you can see between consumer transformation and system transformation, those two scenarios, a heavier weighting of higher societal change technologies in consumer transformation. Hopefully that answers that question.
Thank you, Mark. Our next question is for Lauren. Lauren, welcome to the launch. In making 3 of your 4 scenarios compliant with the net zero target, what are you assuming about UK use of international carbon credits? The current net zero target does not exclude such use of credit. Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks, Catherine. So we don't include international carbon credits. The 3 net zero scenarios are designed so that they meet the UK net zero target in their own right.
Thanks, Lauren. Mark, the next question is for you. You have much higher engagement of vehicle to grid compared with FES 2019. What is the reasoning behind this? I understand that there are multiple scenarios, but this is coming from fleet vehicles or personal use vehicles.
Thanks, Catherine. So just to clarify, I think it's fair to say there's a much wider range of adoption in vehicle-to-grid technology in FES 2020, and this is tied back to our Bridging the Gap to Net Zero program, which we ran earlier in the year, where we did a number of deep dive pieces of analysis and engagement with stakeholders. And the outcome of that was saying that while smart charging technology is quite certain, and there's a lower range of uncertainty in our scenarios this year, for vehicle to grid, there's a much wider range of uncertainty. And that range across our scenarios goes from 5% adoption all the way up to 45% adoption. To answer the part of the question on personal versus fleet options, most of this is around personal or residential vehicle to grid and some workplace, but we have less robust data for fleet vehicle to grid patterns, particularly on the charging patterns and how they might be used. So we'd really appreciate feedback and data and engagement from industry on that specific topic.
Thank you, Mark. The next question is also for you. What is the definition of zero marginal cost generation? Thank you.
All right, thanks, Catherine. So there's probably two answers to that. One is the technical definition, which is zero marginal generation or zero marginal cost generation effectively has no short-run costs, such as fuel costs. But perhaps a better answer gives an example where you can compare, say, wind and solar generation, which is zero marginal cost generation, versus other generation types such as gas or coal, where they do have fuel inputs and additional costs when they generate. And that comes into consideration when sort of pulling together business plans and bidding into markets.
Thanks, Mark. Lauren, we have a question for you. How do you define consumer whole energy demand? Is this the same as final energy consumption?
This is a great question. We often tie ourselves in knots over the different definitions of demand. So yes, consumer whole energy demand is the demand at the end user level. So it's the amount that people use. We also publish our numbers on the system level of demand. So the amount that, for example, would be on the transmission system, which would include losses and energy conversion losses, and also net of embedded generation. So if you log on online, so you should have a link to our website, you'll be able to find the full FES document, which will always have footnotes, which give the full definition of the versions of demand that we're using, and that will also be included in the data workbook.
Thank you, Lauren. The next question is also for you. Can industry electrify completely?
So it's more a case of what have we included in our scenarios. So we haven't included, even in our net zero scenarios, 100% decarbonisation of all of industry. So any emissions that are still left from parts of industry which are hard to decarbonise will be captured using other technologies such as CCUS or BECCS.
Thanks, Lauren. We've had a question about FES in 5. Is it available as a download? Yes, I can confirm it is available as a download. And again, if you click on the website, you will see the whole suite of FES 2020 documents for you to view and download FES in 5. Our next question.
Sorry, Catherine, if I could just jump in there. You can also request to get a printed version sent to your homes, so we can provide a link to that as well.
Thanks, Lauren. Mark, this next question is for you. Speed of decarbonisation has an axis break, separating net zero scenarios from steady progression. How far apart are those scenarios in reality? Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Catherine. Yes, so there is an axis break, and that just denotes the scale which say net zero scenarios, how far further down that decarbonisation axis they are from steady progression. In terms of numbers, so thank you, Lauren, for holding up your 5 copy, because I have mine here, so I get the numbers right. But for example, in the carbon intensity of the electricity supply, today the carbon intensity in terms of grams of carbon dioxide equivalent for each kilowatt hour, today the number is 167. Across all of our net zero scenarios, by 2050, they're all negative. They'll be between negative 72 and negative 99 grams per kilowatt hour. When you look at steady progression, it's still positive, and it's 61 grams per kilowatt hour. So steady progression has dropped by about 2/3, but it's still a large amount of emissions compared to those net zero scenarios, hence that break in the axis to denote that.
Thanks, Mark. Lauren, a question for you. When is your NGESO definition of green gas? What is your definition, sorry, of green gas? How will it be made?
So this is covered in the gas supply section of the Future Energy Scenarios document. And as per the last question, you'll always get full definitions included in there. So this is biomethane and bio-SNG, so synthetic natural gas.
Thanks, Lauren. Mark, the next question is for you. Will you talk later in the week about seasonality and storage? What will a cold winter day look like? How much storage will be required if energy demand is high and intermittent electricity production is low? Will you bring back load duration curves to help us understand gaps in the energy system intra-year and not just looking at annual demand?
Thanks, Catherine. That's a great question, and I'm sure in our deep dives later in the week we'll go into much more detail. From memory, I think in the flexibility presentation on Thursday, one of our analysts, Rob Nickerson, will be going through what an average day or what a specific day in 2050 might look like, and looking through different flexibility options or needs for that, including storage. So I'd encourage anyone to dial into that webinar to see much more detail on that.
Thanks, Mark. The next question is also for you. Would you say steady progression represents business as usual, or does it require more drivers than we have currently?
So I don't think any of the scenarios are business as usual, and that's the point in that as you go into the future, there's changes. The only thing that we do know will happen. Steady progression is the slowest credible rate of decarbonisation. And so this is steady progression as a result of us doing robust research and stakeholder engagement to understand what we think that lower end of the envelope of speed of decarbonisation and societal change might look like.
Thanks, Mark. We've had a question regarding comparison of FES 2019 to FES 2020. And I'd like to remind stakeholders that we actually produce a comparison document that is included in the suite of documents that we published this morning. And again, you can find it through the link on your tab to the website. Moving on to the next question, this is for Lauren. It looks like none of the net zero scenarios have any biomethane production. Is that right? I think you said that scarce biosources would be deployed elsewhere. What happens to the current methane carrying gas network under those scenarios?
Thanks, Catherine. So yes, there's no biomethane in 2050, but it's used on the lead up to 2050 to allow us to transition quickly to a net zero system. And depending on which scenario you're looking at, the impact on networks would be different. So for example, in some scenarios, some of the natural gas network would be used for carrying hydrogen. And also it should be noted that there will be different localised impacts as well.
Thanks, Lauren. Mark, what are the implications of the different gas scenarios for the future viability of the NTS?
Thanks, Catherine. So FES is that FES analysis is not constrained by networks. So I think the first thing to note is it's looking at an unconstrained market and where supply and demand might go into the future. So I think that's the first thing to note. And then if you look across the different scenarios, there are lots of different options. So you can see different levels of natural gas, but also hydrogen. And when you reach a certain level of hydrogen and a certain number of consumers using it, then questions are already being asked by industry as to how we might utilize existing infrastructure to transport that hydrogen. So I think it's probably worth dialing into the natural gas and bioresource webinar on Thursday to go into more detail there. But the answer there is a scenario.
Thanks, Mark. Lauren, are the demand calculations based on ACS? Do we know the winter peak demand for each of the FES scenarios?
Yeah, the peak demands are average cold spell, so yes, they're ACS. And for each of the scenarios, the peak demands are included. You can find numbers for this in the FES in 5 and also in the data workbook and the full FES document.
Thanks, Lauren. I had a question asking about the data workbook that Lauren's just mentioned. I can confirm that that again is included in the full suite document and was published this morning on our website and is available for you to download. Our next question is for Mark. I think we've already touched on this through this morning's presentations. How are the impacts of COVID-19 covered in FES?
Right, so COVID-19 impacts are not covered in FES. I mentioned that earlier in the analysis overview. There are two reasons for that. Firstly, the analysis and stakeholder engagement was well underway when COVID-19 started to emerge, and so it was a tad late in the process to incorporate that. But I think more importantly is that the impacts of COVID-19 will continue to be seen into the future, and so while we've seen some short-term impacts and reductions in demand and changing consumer behaviour across the system. And you can see more detail on that in our summer outlook report, which we published earlier in the year, and our winter review. You can also understand that there are much longer term impacts around consumer behavioural change. And so we'll be working with stakeholders throughout the rest of this year and on an ongoing basis to understand how those are emerging and how we should incorporate them into future scenarios.
Thanks, Mark. Lauren, we have a question for you touching on hydrogen. It's fascinating and positive to see the reliance on hydrogen being called out here. To clarify, is the analysis saying that only by removing all natural gas from our transmission and distribution system, we will achieve net zero in the system transformation leading the way and consumer transformation scenarios?
Thanks, good question, Catherine. No, that's not quite right. So you could still have natural gas, but you would need to offset the emissions from that with CCUS. However, I should highlight that unabated natural gas is not consistent with a net zero scenario.
Thanks, Lauren. Mark, this is a question for you. How is National Grid viewing the functioning of the current wholesale and balancing market in the more aggressive decarbonisation scenarios for net zero world? Will the merit order dispatch system for price setting in particular in the wholesale market still be fit for purpose, or will that require a complete overhaul?
Thanks, Catherine. That's a great question. So that's a thing we touched on in our third key message, and it's a key area we're currently looking into. We think it's a really, really important one. And so I mentioned in the next steps part of the presentation that we'll be doing our Bridging the Gap to Net Zero program later this year. And one of the key areas of deep dive in that is how markets need to evolve in the future to work with zero marginal cost generation and the new peaks and troughs that we're going to be seeing in a decarbonising energy system. So without having a clear answer to that today, I'd really encourage everybody to get involved in that piece of work because I think it's a fascinating question.
Thanks, Mark. Touching on hydrogen again, Lauren. As per the CCC report, most of the hydrogen production is done by electrolysis for aggressive scenarios. What is the Fed's view on electrolysis?
So we've tried to cover a range of different technologies across the scenarios, not necessarily picking one winner overall. So we've used system transformation with more electrolysis. So we've used one scenario which has more electrolysis and another scenario which has more SMR, but there's still a mix within each of those scenarios, and that mix is more equal in leading the way as well.
Thanks, Lauren. Mark, how do your scenarios compare with those developed elsewhere?
Yeah, so our scenarios, I think they are a view of the future, and I think it's important to remember the purpose of why any set of scenarios are created. And so we work closely with industry stakeholders, in particular other organizations that produce future scenarios, to make sure that any differences and comparisons are there for the right reasons. So I'd say that our scenarios are really important in making those decisions for planning network investments and planning into the future across all networks, and therefore have a lot of robust stakeholder evidence behind them. We work closely with other organizations such as CCC, BEIS, the Energy Networks Association, all of whom produce their own scenarios for different reasons. And I think there are some interesting differences and similarities across those.
Thanks, Mark. Fintan, we have a question for you. Fintan, what is the ESO's role in climate change?
That's an excellent question. I mean, so the ESO set out when it was legally separated in April last year that one of its ambitions was to enable an electricity system that could operate carbon-free, and that is consistent with the move towards net zero, but it's also consistent with delivering energy and electricity at least cost to consumers, because it enables us to use that renewable generation when it is available. And there was Mark talked earlier about the use of zero variable cost generation, so that's absolutely in line with that. So we see our role as making sure that we facilitate that transition of the energy system. But it's not for us to pick winners. There was a conversation there about scenarios, and the reason why there are different scenarios is to enable us to stress test different technologies, to look at the different options of how the future might develop out. And we see our role as a key enabler in that transition to a net zero economy in the UK.
Thanks, Fintan. We now have a question regarding EVs. Lauren, I think this one's for you. What are your projections of no EVs by 2050? Sorry, what are your projections of number of EVs by 2050? Does this align to the CCC numbers?
So we vary our EV uptake across the different scenarios. Leading the Way has an internal combustion engine ban in 2032, consumer transformation and system transformation in 2035, and in steady progression, that's in 2040. In all net zero scenarios, we assume that there are no ICE vehicles on the road by 2050. And using my handy reference guide, the maximum potential of number of electric vehicles by 2050 is 28 million. Unfortunately, I can't do a comparison with the CCC off the top of my head. I would recommend logging into the one of the later sessions on in the week, where you'll hear more about transport, and hopefully we can pick that up there.
Thanks, Lauren. Mark, I think this question's for you. Mark, can you explain how emissions from the power sector can go negative?
Yes. So that comes down to essentially carbon accounting and how the carbon accounting rules work, so that we can make sure that we do reach net zero by 2050. So in our scenarios, we use bioenergy combined with carbon capture and storage to achieve negative emissions. And in thinking about that, we need to think about the whole life cycle of that process. So if you think the feedstock, which is used to go into the bioenergy generation, is essentially trees, and through their life cycle, they soak up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They're removing carbon dioxide. And when they're burned to generate electricity, the carbon capture and storage technology captures that carbon and stores it away. And so over that entire lifetime, you're removing carbon from the atmosphere. And so if you get the rest of your power sector to get to zero emission generation, and then combine it with this negative emission technology, you can then have a whole power sector delivering negative emissions.
Thanks, Mark. We have time for a couple more questions. Lauren, in the scenarios, have you indicated which areas of the country have a hydrogen or electricity solution for heat?
So no, we haven't. The FES is more of a national document. So we may refer to some of the specific projects which are going on at the moment. So there's a lot of innovation projects looking at heat at the moment. We're also developing our heat modelling ourselves. So we're hoping to publish a lot more information on that in FES 21. You'll be able to find out some more information in some of our downstream publications or in some of the additional data workbooks that we publish online around the spatial numbers that fit behind FES and then lead into the NOAA and ETIS processes.
Thanks, Lauren. We now have a question about climate change. Mark, I think this one might be for you. How do the scenarios take account of climate change related effects on, I'll start again. How do the scenarios take account of climate change related effects on power production, transmission and distribution, for example, extreme weather events?
Thanks, Catherine. So it's a really interesting one, and it's been a conversation we've had in the team a number of times. I'd say probably there are two issues to think of. One of them is extreme weather events. The other one is a general increase in the average temperature and what climate changes might come along with that. And so currently across our scenarios, we hold that constant across all scenarios, but we do have work going on in the background to understand how we might be able to flex that across scenarios, and that's something we'll definitely be looking into in the future. But currently, that's a fixed assumption across all scenarios.
Thanks, Mark. Lauren mentioned this earlier on. If you would like to receive a paper copy of FES in 5, then please do drop an email to the FES email address. Again, you'll find the link on your screen, and we'll provide you with a paper copy of FES in 5. As Fintan or Mark mentioned, I can't remember who, this morning, the main FES report is interactive, and following set of feedback, we're not producing a paper copy this year. However, there will be a version for you to print at home at your convenience. We have time for a couple more questions. How do interconnectors contribute under peak circumstances? Are they importing or exporting, or somewhere in between? Lauren, I think this one might be for you.
Yeah, certainly. So the document describes how interconnectors behave across each of the different scenarios. We assume that they're price driven, so looking at the price differential between Europe and the UK. But imports are assumed in most scenarios. If you log on to the flexibility session, which is on Thursday this week, you'll be able to see a lot more about how and when interconnectors are used and how this flexes between imports, exports and imports again over the time period up to 2025, and also how regularly they change between import and export during the day. But yeah, price driven, so at peak, sometimes importing, also dependent on weather. So we use specific weather years as part of our interconnector reporting. So I'm probably answering that too much now for this session.
Thanks, Lauren, that's great. I think this will be your last question, Lauren, for this morning. What percentage effectiveness is being assumed for CCS?
This is a really good question. We get asked this a lot. So last year for our net zero scenarios, we didn't quite meet 100%. This was consistent with what the CCC have done. But this year we are reaching zero emissions, and part of that requires CCUS, but they aren't 100% efficient. They still always emit some carbon dioxide. So in our scenarios, we've flexed how efficient these are. So it ranges between 90% and 97% by 2050.
Thanks, Lauren. That now brings us to the end of the Q&A session and this morning's FES 2020 launch. I'm sorry if we didn't get round to answering all your questions. As I mentioned, we'll be publishing the FES Q&A document during August. Thank you for your time this morning, and we hope you found it interesting and useful. Please do join us during the rest of the week for our other events, and as we've mentioned, our website contains more information. Thank you again, and I wish you all a good day.